You signed up for a class action lawsuit because a company wronged you. Maybe it was a data breach that exposed your personal information, or a defective product that cost you money, or a drug that made you sick. You waited years for justice. Then one day, a check arrives in the mail for $3.75. Meanwhile, the lawyers who represented you, they walked away with $42 million. And the corporation that harmed you, they're still in business, stronger than ever, because the settlement was cheaper than actually changing anything. This is the class action trap, and it's happening every single day across America. Today, we're sitting down with attorney Mike to expose how the system designed to protect victims has become a money-making machine that benefits everyone except the people it was meant to help. What he reveals will shock you. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The office was quiet, except for the soft hum of the air conditioning. Sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting long shadows across the polished desk where Mike sat, his hands folded in front of him. Across from him, Valerie Kim adjusted her recorder and leaned forward, her expression serious. So, Mike, let's start with the basics. When most people hear about a class action lawsuit, they think it's their chance at justice. They think they're going to be made whole. What's the reality? Mike shook his head slowly, a bitter smile crossing his face. The reality is that class action lawsuits have become one of the greatest legal scams in American history. And I say that as someone who's worked in this system for over 15 years. These lawsuits were designed with noble intentions back in the 1960s and 70s. The idea was simple. If a company harms thousands or millions of people in the same way, those victims shouldn't have to file individual lawsuits. They could band together, pool their resources, and fight back as a unified force. It was supposed to level the playing field. And it doesn't work that way anymore? Mike leaned back in his chair, his jaw tightening. It works exactly the opposite way now. The system has been completely hijacked. Let me give you a real example. 3 years ago, a major tech company had a data breach. 90 million users had their personal information exposed, including social security numbers, addresses, financial data, everything. The company was negligent. They knew their security was outdated, but they didn't want to spend the money to fix it. So what happens? A class action lawsuit gets filed on behalf of all 90 million victims. Valerie nodded, her pen moving quickly across her notepad. And what was the outcome? The case settled for $250 million. Sounds impressive, right? That's the headline everyone sees. But here's what they don't tell you. After legal fees, administrative costs, and all the other expenses, you know what each victim received? $4.37. $4 for having their entire financial identity compromised. Meanwhile, the law firm that handled the case, they took home $63 million in fees. That's insane. How is that even legal? Mike stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the city below. It's legal because the system is designed to benefit lawyers and corporations, not victims. See, here's how it actually works. When a class action settles, the lawyers negotiate what's called a settlement fund. That sounds good on paper, but the dirty secret is that the lawyers get paid first, and they get paid based on the total value of the settlement. not on what victims actually receive. So lawyers have every incentive to negotiate big headline numbers and terrible actual benefits. But don't the victims have to approve the settlement? Mike turned back to face her, his expression darkening. Technically, yes, but it's a rigged game. First, most victims don't even know they're part of the lawsuit until it's too late. They get a notice in the mail, usually written in dense legal jargon that nobody understands. The notice tells them they have 30 days to object or opt out. But here's the thing. Most people don't even open it. They think it's junk mail. And even if they do read it, they have no idea what their options are or what the settlement actually means. So they just go along with whatever the lawyers negotiated. Exactly. And here's where it gets even worse. The lawyers and the corporations work together to structure settlements that look good on paper but are worthless in practice. For example, they'll offer coupons instead of cash. I worked on a case where a furniture company sold defective sofas that fell apart within months. Thousands of people bought them. The settlement gave each victim a $25 coupon toward their next purchase from the same company that screwed them over in the first place. And those coupons expired in 6 months and couldn't be combined with any other offers. That's not justice. That's insulting. Mike walked back to his desk and pulled out a thick file folder. It gets worse. Want to know the real nightmare? The corporations actually prefer class actions now. They used to fear them, but now they welcome them, because a class action settlement includes something called a release. Once the settlement is approved, every single member of the class gives up their right to sue individually. So, even if you got $4 from the settlement and your actual damages were $50,000, too bad. You can never sue again. The corporation gets a get-out-of-jail-free card, and they pay pennies on the dollar. Valerie's eyes widened. So these settlements actually protect the companies? That's exactly what they do. The corporations know that defending against 90 million individual lawsuits would cost them billions and take decades. But one class action settlement? They can wrap it up in 2 years, pay a fraction of what they should, and walk away clean. The lawyers get rich, the corporation gets immunity, and the victims get nothing. It's a perfect system, just not for the people it was designed to help. Mike opened the folder and pulled out a document, sliding it across the desk. This is a settlement agreement from last year. Major pharmaceutical company. Their drug caused kidney damage in over 200,000 patients. Some people needed dialysis for the rest of their lives. The settlement was $900 million. Sounds massive, right? Valerie picked up the document, scanning the pages. What did the victims actually get? The average payout was $1,100. $1,100 for kidney damage that would require hundreds of thousands in medical care over a lifetime. But the law firm? They took $320 million in fees. And the pharmaceutical company. They're still selling the drug in other countries where the lawsuits haven't hit yet. Mike leaned forward, his voice dropping. But here's what I'm about to tell you next. This is the part that nobody talks about. There's a reason these settlements are structured this way, and it involves a secret partnership between the lawyers and the corporations that goes deeper than anyone realizes. Valerie set down her pen, her expression intense. What do you mean by secret partnership? Aren't the lawyers supposed to be fighting against the corporations? Mike smiled grimly. That's what everyone thinks. But let me explain how this really works. In a class action lawsuit, there's something called lead counsel or class counsel. These are the law firms that actually control the case and negotiate the settlement. Now, here's the key. The same handful of elite law firms handle almost all major class actions in this country. We're talking maybe 20 or 30 firms total that dominate this entire field. Okay? So there are specialist firms. What's wrong with that? Nothing on the surface. But here's where it gets interesting. These firms file hundreds of class actions every year. They're not waiting for victims to come to them. They're actively searching for potential cases, filing lawsuits, and racing to get appointed as lead counsel. It's become an industry. And like any industry, it runs on relationships. Relationships with who? Mike pulled out another document from his file. With the defense attorneys who represent the corporations. See, these class action lawyers and corporate defense lawyers, they face each other case after case, year after year. They attend the same conferences. They know each other's families. They golf together. They're friends. And over time, they develop what I call settlement relationships. They know what each side will accept. They know how to structure deals that satisfy the judge, generate big fee, awards for the plaintiff's lawyers, and minimize actual payouts to victims. That sounds like collusion. Mike raised his hands. Careful. It's not illegal collusion. It's just how the system works. But the effect is the same. Let me give you an example. I know a plaintiff's firm that filed a class action against a major bank for illegal overdraft fees. The bank had taken about $8 billion from customers over 10 years through these fees. The case had real merit, strong evidence, everything you'd want. What happened? The case settled within 18 months. The settlement fund was $410 million. That's about 5% of what the bank actually stole. The lawyers got $92 million in fees. And here's the kicker. 6 months later, that same plaintiff's firm filed another class action against the same bank for a different issue. And 2 years after that, another one. These lawyers file cases against the same corporations over and over again. Why would they keep doing business with each other if they're supposed to be adversaries? Because it's profitable for everyone, except the victims. The plaintiff's lawyers get their fees. The defense lawyers bill their hours. And the corporations get to settle for pennies and move on. Everyone wins, except the little guy, who actually got hurt. It's like professional wrestling. The fight looks real, but everybody's following a script. Valerie shook her head in disbelief. So, what you're telling me is that the lawyers representing the victims have no incentive to actually fight for maximum compensation. Mike nodded emphatically. Exactly. Their incentive is to settle quickly and move on to the next case. See, these firms operate on volume. They'd rather settle 10 cases for mediocre amounts than fight one case to the bitter end for maximum recovery. Fighting means years of litigation, millions in expenses, and the risk of losing. Settling means guaranteed fees, and they can move on to the next payday. Time is money. But don't judges oversee these settlements? Don't they make sure victims are treated fairly? Mike laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. That's the theory. In reality, judges are overwhelmed. They have massive caseloads and limited resources. When a class action settlement comes before them, They see that both sides have agreed. They see expert testimony saying it's fair, and they see no objection from class members. Because remember, most victims don't even know what's happening. So they approve it. Judges approve over 95% of class action settlements. Valerie leaned forward. You said there are no objections from class members. Can't victims object if they think the settlement is unfair? They can try. But here's another dirty trick. If a victim wants to object, they have to file legal papers, often appear in court, and make arguments against lawyers who do this for a living. Most people don't have the knowledge or resources to do that. And even if they do, the objections are almost always overruled. I've seen cases where victims hired their own lawyers to object, presented compelling evidence that the settlement was a ripoff, and the judge approved it anyway. Why would a judge do that? Because judges want to clear their dockets. A settled case is a closed case. An objection means more hearings, more briefs, more delays. Plus, judges rely on the lawyers to tell them what's fair. If the plaintiff's lawyers and defense lawyers both say the settlement is reasonable, the judge usually defers to their expertise, even though those lawyers have conflicting interests. Mike stood and walked to a bookshelf lined with legal texts and case files. Let me tell you about the worst example I've ever seen. It involves a company called Horizon Pharmaceuticals, a case I worked on early in my career. This case opened my eyes to just how corrupt this system really is. What happened there was so egregious, so brazenly unjust, that it changed my entire view of class action law. He pulled out a thick binder and returned to the desk. Horizon manufactured a drug called Ventrix. It was prescribed to over 500,000 people for chronic pain. But the company knew, absolutely knew, that Ventrix caused severe liver damage in a significant percentage of users. They had internal studies showing this. They buried those studies and kept selling the drug. Eventually, people started dying. Liver failure, transplants, deaths. The FDA finally forced a recall. But by then, the damage was done. That's horrific. Multiple class actions were filed across the country. They got consolidated into one massive case. The evidence against Horizon was overwhelming. Documents, emails, whistleblowers, everything. This should have been a billion-dollar case, maybe more. Thousands of people had permanent organ damage. Families had lost loved ones. The company deserved to be destroyed. What was the settlement? $670 million. And before you think that sounds like a lot, let me break it down. There were 480,000 class members. After legal fees, administrative costs, and other deductions, the average payout was about $900. $900 for liver damage. Some people got less, some got a little more, depending on their injury tier. But that was the average. That's unconscionable. The lawyers got $214 million. $214 million. And here's the absolute worst part. Horizon Pharmaceuticals didn't even pay the full settlement amount. The way it was structured, they paid into a fund over 5 years. But the company filed for bankruptcy protection in year 3, so the remaining payments were never made. Victims got about 60% of their already pathetic settlement amounts. The lawyers, they got paid in full up front. How is that possible? Because the lawyers negotiated payment terms that protected their fees first. They got their money immediately from an escrow account funded by Horizon's insurance company. But The victim payments were structured as future obligations of Horizon itself, which meant when Horizon went bankrupt, those obligations disappeared. The lawyers knew the company was in financial trouble. They structured the deal to protect themselves and hung the victims out to dry. Valerie's face had gone pale. Did anyone face consequences for this? Mike closed the binder with a heavy thud. No. The lawyers who negotiated that settlement, they're still practicing. They're still filing class actions. They're still getting appointed as lead counsel. And they're still doing the exact same thing to new victims. Valerie took a moment to collect herself, visibly shaken by what she had just heard. She reached for her water glass and took a long sip before continuing. Mike, I have to ask, if this system is so broken, why hasn't anyone done anything about it? Why hasn't Congress stepped in? Why aren't there laws preventing this kind of abuse? Mike leaned back in his chair, his expression weary. That's the question everyone asks once they understand how this works. And the answer is complicated, but it comes down to one thing: power. The class action bar, these elite firms I'm talking about, they're incredibly powerful. They donate millions to political campaigns. They lobby heavily. And here's the thing, they position themselves as champions of the little guy, as the ones holding corporations accountable. So any politician who tries to reform the system gets painted as being pro-corporation and anti-consumer. But you're saying the current system doesn't actually help consumers, right? But that's not how it's portrayed publicly. These firms run ads showing themselves as heroes, taking on big pharma, big tech, big oil. They fund consumer advocacy groups that oppose any reforms. They've created this narrative where they're the good guys and anyone who criticizes them is a corporate shill. It's brilliant marketing, but it's a lie. Valerie flipped through her notes. What about the corporations themselves? Don't they want reform? After all, they're the ones being sued. Mike shook his head. That's the irony. The big corporations actually prefer the current system because it's predictable and cheap. They know that a class action will cost them a fraction of what individual litigation would cost. They can budget for it. They can insure against it. And most importantly, they get finality. Once a class action settles, they're immune from future lawsuits from those class members. It's the cost of doing business, and it's a lot cheaper than actually fixing the problems that caused the harm in the first place. So both sides benefit from keeping things the way they are. Exactly. It's a symbiotic relationship. The only losers are the actual victims who believe they're getting justice when they sign up for these lawsuits. Let me tell you about another case that really illustrates this. About 5 years ago, a major credit reporting agency had a data breach. This was a massive breach, one of the largest in history. 147 million Americans had their data compromised. I remember that one. The settlement made national news. Right. The settlement was $425 million, with up to $380 million available for victim compensation. The headlines made it sound like people would finally get meaningful relief. But here's what actually happened. The settlement offered victims a choice: either 10 years of free credit monitoring or a cash payment of $125. That doesn't sound too bad. Wait for it. When the settlement was first announced, millions of people signed up for the cash option. But there was a catch buried in the fine print. The $380 million wasn't guaranteed to be paid out. It was a cap, not a floor, and the cash payments would be divided among everyone who claimed them. So, as more and more people chose cash over credit monitoring, the individual payments got smaller and smaller. How small are we talking? The final payment was $6.32 per person. $6 for having your entire financial identity compromised. Meanwhile, the credit reporting agency, they paid the settlement and moved on. No real consequences, no meaningful changes to their security practices, and the lawyers, they got $96 million in fees, which was guaranteed and paid in full regardless of how many victims claimed compensation. Valerie looked down at her notes, then back up at Mike. So the settlement was deliberately structured to discourage people from claiming cash? Not just discourage. It was designed to fail. See, the lawyers knew that millions of people would choose cash over credit monitoring. They knew the fund would be depleted. But they also knew that once people saw they were only getting $6, they'd be furious with the credit agency, not with the lawyers who negotiated the terrible deal. It's misdirection. The corporation takes the heat while the lawyers walk away with their fees. Mike stood and walked to a filing cabinet, pulling out another folder. But there's something even more insidious about that case. The settlement also included something called claims administration fees. These are the costs of actually processing claims, sending out notices, managing the settlement website, all of that. Guess how much the administrator was paid? I'm almost afraid to ask. $54 million, $54 million to process claims and send emails. And who do you think owned the claims administration company? No. Mike nodded grimly. A company partially owned by one of the law firms representing the class. They were literally paying themselves with money from the settlement fund. It's a side business for these firms. They create claims administration companies, get them appointed to handle settlements, and then bill massive fees for services that should cost a fraction of that amount. That has to be illegal. It's not. It just has to be approved by the court. And judges approve it because, again, both sides agree to it, and there's no meaningful objection. The victims don't know enough to object. And even if they did, they don't have standing to challenge the fees paid to administrators. It's a closed loop. Valerie set her pen down, rubbing her temples. This is overwhelming. Every layer you peel back reveals another level of corruption. And I haven't even gotten to the worst part yet. What I'm about to tell you involves what happens after these settlements are approved. There's an entire secondary market that most people don't know exists. It's where the real money is made, and it has nothing to do with helping victims. Mike pulled out several documents covered in complex financial charts and spreadsheets. This is the settlement claims market. Once a class action settles, there are companies that buy up people's claims for pennies on the dollar. They contact victims and offer them immediate cash, usually about 20 to 30% of what their claim is worth, in exchange for signing over their rights to the settlement payment. Wait, so victims can sell their claims? It's technically legal in most jurisdictions. These companies are called claims aggregators or settlement funding companies. They're usually run by investors who have connections to the law firms handling the cases. They know what the settlement terms are before they're publicly announced, so they can start contacting victims early. Valerie's eyes widened. That's insider trading for lawsuits. It's not technically insider trading because settlement claims aren't securities. But you're right about the concept. These aggregators make huge profits. They buy claims for 30 cents on the dollar, then collect the full amount when the settlement pays out. And the victims, they're usually desperate for money and don't understand what they're giving up. So they sell without realizing they could wait a few months and get 3 times as much. Are the lawyers involved in these companies? Mike smiled bitterly. Officially, no. Bar rules prohibit lawyers from having a financial interest in their clients' claims beyond their fee agreement. But unofficially, there are all kinds of connections. Lawyers refer clients to these aggregators. Family members of lawyers run these companies. There are consulting agreements and referral fees. It's a whole shadow economy built on exploiting desperate people. This just keeps getting worse. The worst part is that this entire system is completely legal. Everything I'm describing, the inadequate settlements, the massive legal fees, the claims administration racket, the claims buying market, all of it operates within the bounds of the law. The system isn't broken. It's working exactly as designed. It's just not designed to help victims. Mike closed the folder and looked directly at Valerie. And there's one more thing I need to tell you about. It involves a case I'm working on right now, and it's the most egregious example I've ever encountered of how this system destroys lives while making lawyers rich. But before I get into that, you need to understand the human cost. Valerie leaned forward, her recorder still running. The human cost. That's what this is really about, isn't it? Behind all these numbers and legal maneuvers, there are real people whose lives have been destroyed. Mike nodded slowly, his expression somber. Exactly. And that's what gets lost in all of this. When we talk about settlements of $400 million or $600 million, those numbers sound enormous. But when you divide them among hundreds of thousands of victims, and then subtract the legal fees and administrative costs, you're left with almost nothing. And these aren't just numbers on a spreadsheet. These are people who trusted the system to make them whole. He pulled out a thin manila folder from his desk drawer. Let me tell you about Austin Ford. He's not part of the current case I'm working on, but his story illustrates exactly what I'm talking about. Austin was a construction worker in Ohio. 38 years old, married, 2 kids. He was prescribed a medication for his diabetes called Glycomax. His doctor told him it was safe, effective, and FDA approved. What happened to him? 6 months after he started taking Glycomax, Austin started having severe abdominal pain. He went to the emergency room multiple times. They ran tests but couldn't figure out what was wrong. The pain got worse. Eventually, he was diagnosed with acute pancreatitis. His pancreas was being destroyed by the medication. He needed multiple surgeries, spent weeks in the hospital, and ended up with permanent damage. He can't work anymore. He's in constant pain. His medical bills exceeded $300,000, and that's just the beginning because he'll need ongoing treatment for the rest of his life. That's terrible. Was there a class action? Oh, yes. Thousands of people were injured by Glycomax. The manufacturer knew about the pancreatic risks, but didn't adequately warn patients or doctors. A massive class action was filed. The case settled for $890 million. Sounds like justice, right? I'm guessing Austin didn't see much of that money. Austin's share of the settlement, after legal fees and based on his injury tier, was $4,200. $4,000 for permanent disability, hundreds of thousands in medical debt, and a destroyed quality of life. Meanwhile, the law firm got $267 million in fees. Austin can't pay his mortgage. He lost his house. His marriage fell apart under the financial stress. His kids had to leave their schools. His entire life was destroyed. And the system gave him $4,000 and called it justice. Valerie's hand trembled slightly as she wrote, "Did he try to opt out and sue individually? That's the tragedy. He didn't know he could. The notice he received was so full of legal jargon that he didn't understand what opting out meant or how to do it. By the time he realized what was happening, the deadline had passed. He was locked into the class action, whether he wanted to be or not. And now, because of the settlement release, he can never sue the pharmaceutical company again. They're protected forever, and Austin is left with nothing." Mike closed the folder gently, treating it with a reverence that suggested he knew Austin personally. This is what the class action trap really means. It's not just about lawyers getting rich, though that's part of it. It's about a system that takes away people's rights, gives them pennies in return, and protects the corporations that harmed them. Austin's story is repeated thousands of times in every major class action settlement in this country. How many people like Austin are out there? Millions. And most of them don't even realize they've been cheated because they have nothing to compare it to. They get their check for a few hundred or a few $1,000s, and they think that's just how the system works. They don't know that their claim could have been worth 10 times or 100 times more if they had been able to sue individually. They don't know that the lawyers negotiated away their rights for a fraction of what they deserved. Valerie looked up from her notes. "You mentioned you're working on a case right now. Is it similar to Austin's situation?" Mike's jaw tightened. "It's worse. Much worse. The case I'm working on involves a company called Meridian Financial Services. They ran a predatory lending scheme that targeted low-income families, minority communities, people who were desperate and vulnerable. They charged illegal interest rates, hid fees in complex contracts, and when people couldn't pay, they seized their homes, their cars, everything. Thousands of families were affected. The evidence of wrongdoing is overwhelming, and there's a class action? There is. And it's the most corrupt settlement I've ever seen. What's happening in this case, it represents everything wrong with the system, distilled into one nightmare scenario. The lawyers, the corporation, the judge, they're all playing their parts perfectly. And the victims are about to get destroyed all over again, but this time with the court's blessing. Valerie shifted in her seat, her expression tense. "Tell me about Meridian Financial Services. What exactly did they do?" Mike opened a thick file on his desk, revealing pages of documents and highlighted sections. Meridian targeted people who had been rejected by traditional banks, people with poor credit, immigrants, single mothers, elderly folks on fixed incomes. They advertised themselves as a second-chance lender. Their ads promised fair terms and a path to financial stability. But it was all a lie. He pulled out a sample contract and slid it across the desk. "Look at this. This is one of their standard loan agreements. The contract is 47 pages long, single-spaced, filled with legal terminology that even lawyers struggle to understand." Buried in Section 32, subsection D, paragraph 4, there's a clause that allows Meridian to change the interest rate at any time for any reason without notice to the borrower. That can't be legal. It shouldn't be. But the way they worded it, they exploited loopholes in state lending laws. They'd give someone a loan at 8% interest, which sounds reasonable. Then 6 months later, they'd jack it up to 24%. The borrower would get a statement showing their payment had tripled, but by then they were already trapped. If they tried to pay off the loan early, there were massive prepayment penalties. So people couldn't escape once they were in. Exactly. And it gets worse. Meridian also sold mandatory insurance products with every loan: credit life insurance, disability insurance, property insurance. They told borrowers it was required by law, which was a complete lie. These insurance products were garbage. They rarely paid out, and they cost a fortune, but the premiums were rolled into the loan amount, so people were paying interest on insurance they didn't need and couldn't use. Valerie shook her head in disgust. How did they get away with this for so long? Because they were careful. They operated in states with weak consumer protection laws. They structured their business through multiple subsidiaries, so it was hard to track the full scope of their operation, and they targeted the most vulnerable people, the ones least likely to complain or understand they were being cheated. By the time regulators caught on, Meridian had been operating for almost 12 years and had originated over $3 billion in predatory loans. $3 billion. How many people are we talking about? The class action includes approximately 86,000 families. 86,000. Some lost their homes to foreclosure. Others are still drowning in debt they'll never be able to repay. Credit scores destroyed. Bankruptcies. Lives ruined. And Meridian's executives, they made hundreds of millions in profits while their victims suffered. Mike's voice grew harder, more intense. But here's what makes this case different from all the others. We have everything we need to win. We have internal emails showing executives knew exactly what they were doing. We have recordings of training sessions where loan officers were taught how to deceive borrowers. We have testimony from former employees willing to confirm the fraud. This should be a slam dunk case for massive damages. So what's the problem? The problem is the settlement. The lead counsel negotiated a deal that's an absolute betrayal of the class members. And I've been trying to stop it, but I'm running out of time. Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoy this one, you won't want to miss this. Just click to watch, and don't forget to subscribe.